Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, desolators, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I'm doing a video on the fact that they keep talking about World War III is coming, but in a lot of realistic ways, one could say World War III is already here. There are conflicts going on all over the globe. Some of them have been continuing for years and decades. A good example of that is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's one of the biggest wars in global history. There's hundreds of thousands of casualties. It's been going on for decades, but of course, you never hear anything about it. So, of course, one of the themes is that there's conflicts going on all over the globe, and there's no big conflict in the United States. There's no big conflict in Europe proper. There's no big conflicts in China, but the rest of the world is engulfed in war and various kinds of conflicts. Sometimes they involve standing armies, sometimes they involve insurgency, sometimes they involve drug cartels, but the numbers are huge and it's all over the place. And one can certainly make the argument that as long as it's brown people being killed all over Latin America and Africa and the Middle East, it's just a speed bump for the statist narrative out there, and people don't talk about it. Of course, we have two major wars that are in the headlines every day now, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and then the Gaza situation. I don't want to call it a war because it's not a war, it's a slaughter. It's so uneven. You really can't characterize it as a war. And as I mentioned in a previous video, realistic estimates about how many Palestinians have been killed are more in the vicinity of 200,000. And the narrative out there now is 40,000. But watch my video on the Gaza true casualties, and you get a picture of something very horrific going on there. And one of the things that's fascinating, and both fascinating and horrifying, about the situation we are now with all these low-level regional wars. Somehow low-level regional wars, for some reason, are more acceptable, and they don't even make the news. And well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them have been going on for decades. And a lot of this was brought up in a really landmark book written in 1968 by Juan Bosch. He was the former head of the Dominican Republic, and he wrote a book called Pentagonism, about how colonialism just morphed into Pentagonism, where we have the military-industrial complex, the U.S. empire, basically involved in low-level regional conflicts and perpetual war. And I don't want to downplay the fact that certainly Russia is involved in proxy wars around the world, not so much as the U.S. The U.S. is involved in proxy wars and military operations in virtually every country in the world. And as a matter of fact, Barack Obama, when he was president, created the AFRICOM, the African Military Command, and of course we had military commands covering the rest of the globe, but it was expanded 10 or 15 years ago by Obama creating the AFRICOM. And since the creation of AFRICOM, there's military forces in nearly every country in Africa. And of course, the conflict in Somalia continues, the conflict in North Africa continues, and the U.S. in Mali, Chad, Libya, and the U.S. has a heavy fingerprint all over that. And of course, the U.S. is also assisting in what are called counterterrorism efforts all over Latin America, and once again, nearly every country in Latin America, and then also Southeast Asia. We have all kinds of regional conflicts going on, and the numbers are pretty staggering. As I mentioned earlier, Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, most people have never heard of that country. They're completely unaware of a war that's been going on for decades with hundreds of thousands of casualties. But Pentagonism points out the fact that, ultimately what the empire wants, when you have large regional conflicts involving standing armies, of course it's going to make the headlines. But the real bread and butter is these low-level regional conflicts that can go on for years and decades and continue to make money for the military-industrial complex and to further advance the um, the agenda of the American empire. And part of this is part of it that I found intriguing because it was written in 1968, and it's an absolute blueprint for what we see now. In colonialism, the imperial powers would have to occupy a country, and that was just too expensive. So now it's much more lucrative to control the money systems, to get transnationals, including bankers, in the country, controlling their economies, controlling their currencies, and extracting resources, but without all the risks and the expense of having an occupying army. And part of the quotient is to uh, generate a lot of money by creating and training and arming all these regional players. And so, when you add up all the countries in the world where this is happening, it's very, very lucrative business. But when I talk about World War III is already here, there is a world of global conflict going on out there. And this will take a minute or so, but I'm going to list off all the countries where there is currently conflicts going on of various sorts. A lot of them are so-called counter-terrorist operations, but of course that's deceptive, because what they actually are of course the military of various states that are fighting so-called insurgents or freedom fighters, depending on which side of the coin you're on. And then we also have, like in Latin America and Mexico, we have what basically amounts to huge wars with drug cartels. Drug cartels are seriously armed now. They have all the hardwares for the military. The body counts are really high, and so it qualifies as a war. So let's go through this list. Mozambique, Burkina Faso, Azerbaijan, Thailand, Colombia, Mali, the Saudi Arabian war with Yemen now, which has been going on for 10 years, the Philippines, there's the conflict in India and Kashmir with Pakistan, Ethiopia, there's a war going on there, Turkey, of course, is fighting Kurdish elements and has been for decades, if not longer. Myanmar, of course, there's ongoing conflict there, but nobody really cares about that. Egypt, Democratic Republic of Congo, like I mentioned, Cameroon, of course, the war in Gaza, Palestine, then the Libya war. I want to note Libya because, of course, it had one of the highest per capita in all of Africa. It was a model state, had a great social programs for everyone in the country, free college and things like that, and great infrastructure projects that benefited everyone. So it was a great place to be in Africa. And Gaddafi had disavowed weapons of mass destruction after 9/11 and was no threat to anyone. And then, of course, the theory is that he wanted to create a Pan-African currency based, being gold-backed, for trade in Africa. And so the theory is that's what broke the camel's back with the American empire and the European imperialists. And NATO found it necessary to go in there and destroy the country. And of course, Gaddafi was murdered in the streets. And now we have a complete failed state. We have all these factions vying for control of Libya, and that's going on over a decade now. And of course, one of the more interesting aspects of a place like Libya and Syria is that Al-Qaeda was supposedly the U.S.'s arch enemy, and operating from Afghanistan and Libya and Syria. But now Al-Qaeda is allied with the United States. We armed and trained Al-Qaeda in Libya. We armed and trained Al-Qaeda in Syria, and Al-Qaeda certainly benefited their struggle with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where we left behind billions of dollars of military equipment. So now the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are fully armed. And then we have the Central African Republic. We have incredible situation of what could be described as genocide in Sudan, Somalia. Everybody remembers Black Hawk Down, the American intervention in Somalia. Well, it never stopped, and the U.S. has military there, once again involved in so-called uh, um, insurgent and terrorist operations. And then, of course, we have the major war in Ukraine. So that's theoretically the only war going on in Europe per se, although there's continuing conflicts going on in the broken up Yugoslavia, another NATO failure. They went in there and got involved in a civil war, and the whole country was broken up afterwards. So we still have a lot of conflict going on in Bosnia, for example. We have war going on in Pakistan. There's conflicts internally as well as there confrontations with India over Kashmir. Nigeria, Niger. Interesting thing about Niger recently, of course, is Niger is creating a coalition, and they recently kicked U.S. troops out of Niger. And so a lot of these operations that the American empire are involved in Africa are kind of falling apart, and we'll probably see more of that. As I mentioned, Niger is trying to create a coalition of states in Africa that want to kick out their former uh, um, colonialist countries, including countries in Europe like France, and they want them out. And there's still a conflict going on in Afghanistan. We have border clashes between Afghanistan and Pakistan now, and of course the internal conflicts that are going in Afghanistan between ISIS and Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and then Iraq. It's not in the news anymore, but there's continual conflict going on there. Another failed state that we created, much like Libya. And then Mexico, people don't think about a war going on in Mexico, but in 2020 alone, 34,000 people were killed in the conflict between the Mexican government and the drug cartels. And I mentioned Sudan earlier, but there's a conflict in South Sudan once they separated. And then another quagmire is Syria. One of the things that's interesting about Syria is that, it was in all the headlines back in the day, a supposed civil war, and there's elements of the struggle between the government and Kurdish elements. There was the struggle between Al Qaeda and the Syrian government, and that war never went away. And on top of that, we have U.S. military actually occupying nearly a third of the country now and controlling the oil-rich regions and shipping the oil out of the country. And it's just amazing that situation continue to go on. And but if you look at a map, you'll basically see that all of Latin America is nearly all of Latin America is involved in regional conflicts. Nearly all of the African continent is involved in regional conflicts. Most of Southeast Asia and the Indian continent are involved in conflicts. And the only reason there's big patches of so-called non-conflicts is because we have a large country of Russia where there are not really any internal conflicts, although we certainly had the war in Chechnya not so far back, and I'm sure there's a lot of conflicts going on in all the former Soviet republics. Azerbaijan was one, and they're involved in a regional conflict now. So other than Australia, Europe proper, the United States and Russia and China, you basically would see the entire globe involved in regional conflicts. And if you factor in the fact that the U.S. Empire and China and Russia and Australia and Canada and all those countries are involved in proxy wars all over the globe, essentially the entire world is already at war. So certainly the ante can be upped if the regional conflict in Ukraine and Russia escalates, and we have all these threats of nuclear confrontation, and certainly that would qualify as World War III, but it's merely a technicality. I argue that the entire world is engulfed in conflicts right now, and a lot of them have been going on for years and decades, and that's just the state of things. And so, don't anybody kid themselves. The world is definitely not at peace, and World War III is already here. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.